Aldrich Ames walked through the front entrance of the Soviet embassy on 16th Street Northwest. He carried a briefcase. He did not look nervous. He had rehearsed this moment for weeks, but now that he was actually doing it, everything felt slower than he had imagined. The receptionist looked up. Ames heard himself ask to speak with someone from the political section. His voice sounded normal. Ames was a CIA officer. He worked in the Soviet counterintelligence branch. This position gave him access to the identities of Soviet citizens who worked as agents for the United States. He knew their names, their assignments, their methods of communication. He knew which Soviet military officers were providing intelligence to the CIA. He knew which KGB officers had been turned. He knew who was risking their lives to pass information to America. He also knew that some of those people would die because of what he was about to do. The receptionist made a phone call. Ames waited. He thought about the envelope in his briefcase. Inside were the names of Soviet citizens who worked for the CIA. Not all the names he had access to, just enough to prove his information was genuine, enough to get paid. A man came down to the lobby and introduced himself as a political officer. Ames asked if they could speak privately. The man led him upstairs to a small office. Ames opened his briefcase and removed the envelope. He placed it on the desk between them. "I am an officer of the CIA," Ames said. "I have information that will be valuable to your government. I am willing to provide this information in exchange for payment." The Soviet officer looked at the envelope without touching it. He told Ames to wait. He left the room. Ames sat alone. He did not open the envelope. He already knew what was inside. Names of real people. People who had trusted the CIA to protect them. He thought about his debts, his divorce, his expensive tastes. He needed money, and the Soviets had money. That was the logic. It was simple. It made sense. People made these kinds of decisions every day. This was just business. 20 minutes passed. The door opened. A second man entered with the first officer. He was older, more senior. He introduced himself as Viktor Cherkashin, chief of counterintelligence for the KGB station in Washington. Cherkashin looked at the papers Ames had provided. He recognized some of the names. He asked Ames why he was doing this. "I need money," Ames said. "I have debts. Your government can pay me. I can provide information that will protect your operations." Cherkashin asked questions about CIA organizational structure and procedures. Ames answered every question correctly. His knowledge was detailed and specific. After 30 minutes, Cherkashin told Ames to return in 1 week. The KGB would verify the information and decide whether to proceed. Ames left the embassy the same way he had entered, through the front door in the middle of the afternoon. He walked to his car. His hands were steady. He had just committed espionage. He had just signed death warrants for people whose names he knew. He drove back to CIA headquarters in Langley and returned to his desk as if nothing had changed. 1 week later, Ames returned to the Soviet embassy. Cherkashin was waiting with $50,000 in cash. The money was in a bag. Ames took it without counting. Cherkashin gave him instructions for future contact, dead drops in parks around Washington, signals using chalk marks on mailboxes, procedures for emergency communication. Ames left with the money. Over the next week, the KGB arrested 2 of the Soviet officers whose names Ames had provided. Both were interrogated. Both confessed. Both would eventually be executed. The information was genuine. The relationship was established. October 1985. 6 months after Ames walked through the front door of the Soviet embassy, a different man made a different approach. Robert Hanssen drove to the Soviet embassy compound late at night. He did not enter the building. He did not walk through the front door where cameras would record his face and FBI surveillance teams would identify him. Hanssen worked for the FBI. He knew exactly how the surveillance worked because he had helped design it. Instead, he threw a package over the fence into the compound grounds. Then he drove away. Hanssen was an FBI supervisory special agent. He worked in the Soviet Analytical Unit at FBI headquarters. This position gave him access to classified information about FBI operations against Soviet intelligence. He knew the identities of Soviet officials who had been recruited by the FBI. He knew details of technical surveillance operations. He knew which Soviet diplomats were being monitored and which had been turned. Like Ames, he needed money. He had 6 children and a suburban house that strained his budget. Unlike Ames, Hanssen had done this before. In 1979, he had sold classified documents to Soviet military intelligence. That relationship had lasted 2 years before Hanssen stopped contact, concerned he might be discovered. For 4 years, he had remained dormant. Now he was reactivating himself. The package Hanssen threw over the fence contained classified FBI documents and a letter. The letter explained that he was an FBI officer with access to sensitive information about Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. He offered to provide information in exchange for payment. He did not include his name. He used a pseudonym. He instructed the Soviets to respond by placing a signal at a specific location in a park in Northern Virginia. The package was discovered the next morning by Soviet security personnel. It was delivered to the KGB station. Viktor Cherkashin opened it. Cherkashin read the documents. He recognized immediately that this was intelligence from inside the FBI. The documents described FBI surveillance operations against Soviet diplomats. They included details that only someone with access to FBI operational files would know. Cherkashin now had 2 sources. One in the CIA who walked through the front door and met face to face. One in the FBI who refused all personal contact and communicated only through dead drops and written messages. Both had volunteered. Neither had been recruited. Both had simply appeared, offering secrets in exchange for money. What neither Ames nor Hanssen knew was that they were both reporting to the same handler. Cherkashin managed both relationships separately, keeping their identities compartmented, even within the KGB station. He compared information from the CIA with information from the FBI. He identified which Soviet officials were under suspicion by either agency. He protected Soviet operations and eliminated threats before they materialized. Hanssen placed his first dead drop 2 weeks after throwing the package over the fence. He drove to a park in Northern Virginia, walked to a specific tree, and left a package wrapped in plastic at the base. Inside were classified FBI documents describing surveillance operations against the Soviet embassy. He marked the drop with a signal, a piece of white tape on a nearby signpost, to indicate the package was ready for pickup. That night, a KGB officer retrieved the package. 2 days later, Hanssen returned to check for a response signal. It was there, a piece of red tape on the same signpost. He walked to a different location and found a package containing $20,000 in cash. The system worked. Both men continued. Ames met Cherkashin periodically at the embassy. Hanssen never met anyone. He communicated entirely through dead drops, written messages, and signals. Both were paid regularly. Both provided classified information that compromised American intelligence operations and identified agents who were working against the Soviet Union. Neither man knew the other existed. Summer 1986. 3 agents disappeared within 3 months. Dmitry Polyakov failed to make contact in June. Sergei Motorin went silent in July. Valery Martinov stopped responding in August. All 3 were Soviet intelligence officers who had been providing information to the CIA. All 3 were recalled to Moscow. All 3 would later be executed. This was not random operational failure. This was systematic betrayal. Someone with access to CIA operations was providing names to Soviet intelligence. CIA counterintelligence began an internal investigation. They created a list of personnel with access to the compromised cases. The list contained over 100 names. Aldrich Ames was on that list. His position in Soviet counterintelligence gave him exactly the access required. But so did dozens of others. Ames was interviewed twice in 1986. Both times, he answered questions calmly and provided explanations for his work activities. Investigators found nothing suspicious. What they did not find was the money. Ames had purchased a house in Arlington for over $500,000, paid in cash. He drove an expensive car. He took vacations to Europe. A CIA officer making $60,000 annually should not be able to pay cash for a house worth 10 times his salary. But when asked about his finances, Ames explained that his wife had family money from Colombia. This explanation was accepted without thorough verification. The investigation continued through 1987 and 1988. More agents disappeared. More operations failed. The counterintelligence team knew there was a penetration but could not identify the source. The FBI was conducting its own parallel investigation. Soviet officials recruited by the FBI had stopped responding to contact. Surveillance operations that should have been secure were suddenly detected. Technical operations failed in ways that suggested the targets knew they were being monitored. FBI counterintelligence opened an investigation in 1987. Robert Hanssen was on their list of suspects. His position in the Soviet analytical unit gave him access to FBI operations and recruited agents. He was interviewed. He cooperated fully. Investigators found nothing suspicious. His financial records showed no unusual deposits beyond his salary. What they did not know was that Hanssen was hiding cash in his house, making no large purchases, maintaining the appearance of a middle-class agent living within his means. The CIA investigated CIA personnel. The FBI investigated FBI personnel. Neither agency shared information about their internal counterintelligence work. The institutional barriers that should have been removed remained in place. In 1991, CIA investigators re-examined Aldrich Ames. They looked more carefully at his expenditures and compared them to his known income. The discrepancies were undeniable. Ames had spent over $1 million in 5 years. His salary during that period totaled less than $300,000. The explanation about his wife's Colombian family wealth did not withstand scrutiny. Surveillance of Ames began in May 1993. FBI teams monitored his movements and tracked his financial transactions. In October 1993, surveillance teams observed him making a dead drop in a park. He left a package at a prearranged location. Hours later, a Soviet diplomat retrieved it. Ames was arrested on February 21, 1994. During interrogation, he confessed. He admitted providing classified information to Soviet intelligence beginning in April 1985. He identified the agents he had betrayed. He described his meetings with Viktor Cherkashin at the Soviet embassy. He explained his motivations. He needed money. The Soviets paid. It was that simple. The arrest was announced publicly in late February 1994. The CIA acknowledged that a trusted officer had committed espionage over 9 years. The damage was described as catastrophic. At least 10 agents executed. dozens of operations compromised. The entire CIA Soviet division penetrated at the highest level. At CIA headquarters in Langley, officers who had worked on the investigation felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The penetration had been identified. The traitor was in custody. 9 years of losses could finally be explained. Security reviews would be conducted. Procedures would be improved. But the crisis was over. At FBI headquarters, counterintelligence officers reviewed the Ames case files. They compared the compromises Ames had caused with their own list of failed FBI operations. Some of the FBI losses could be explained by Ames. He had access to some joint CIA-FBI operations. Information he provided to the KGB could have compromised those cases. But not all of them. Some FBI operations that had failed were not connected to CIA cases. Some compromises involved information that Ames would not have had access to. FBI investigators noted these discrepancies, but did not immediately escalate their concerns. Ames had been the big catch. Perhaps these other failures had different explanations. Operational errors, bad luck, Soviet counterintelligence success through routine work rather than penetration. March 1994. 1 month after Ames's arrest, an FBI technical surveillance operation failed. The targets were Russian diplomats in Washington. The operation had been running for months without problems. Suddenly, the targets changed their communication patterns. They stopped using phones that had been monitored. They altered their travel routes. The changes suggested they knew they were under surveillance. The operation had been highly compartmented. Only a small number of FBI personnel knew about it. Aldrich Ames was not one of them. He had been in custody when the operation was running. He could not have compromised it. In June 1994, another FBI source went silent. A Russian intelligence officer who had been providing information stopped making contact. Attempts to re-establish communication failed. The source had been recruited after Ames's arrest. Ames could not have known about this source. Yet the source had been compromised. FBI counterintelligence reviewed the timeline. The pattern was clear. Operations were still failing. Sources were still being lost. This was happening after Ames was in custody, after he had no access to current classified information, after he could no longer be providing intelligence to the Russians. There was another penetration. Someone else was still active. The CIA reviewed its files. Had they missed someone during the Ames investigation? Was there another officer with similar access who had not been adequately scrutinized? They expanded their review. They found no additional suspects. The FBI conducted similar reviews of its personnel. Officers who had access to the operations compromised after February 1994 were re-examined. Robert Hanssen was on that list. But Hanssen had been investigated before, in 1987. He had been cleared. There was no new evidence suggesting his involvement. The FBI investigation stalled. The CIA investigation stalled. Both agencies knew there was likely another penetration, but neither could identify the source. And they still were not fully coordinating their investigations. In 1995, a joint CIA-FBI mole hunting team was finally created. The team was tasked with finding the second penetration. They reviewed files from both agencies. They looked for patterns in the compromises that had occurred after Ames's arrest. They identified several possible suspects, but none with sufficient evidence to justify intensive investigation. Years passed. Operations continued to fail at a lower rate than during the Ames years, but they still failed. Sources were still occasionally compromised. Technical operations still sometimes collapsed in ways that suggested the targets had been warned. The mole hunters knew someone was still out there. They could see the pattern, but they could not find the person. At FBI headquarters, Robert Hanssen sat at his desk and read the reports about the ongoing mole hunt. He understood that Ames's arrest had created both danger and opportunity. The danger was that intensified security procedures made his work more difficult. The opportunity was that investigators believed they had found the main threat. Their attention had been focused on Ames for so long that even after his arrest, they assumed most problems had been solved. Hanssen had been more careful than Ames. He spent almost nothing. He maintained his modest lifestyle. He left no financial trail. He never met his handlers face to face. He communicated only through dead drops and encrypted messages. And he had one additional advantage that Ames never had. Hanssen worked in FBI counterintelligence. He knew what the mole hunters were looking for because he was reading their reports. He knew which investigative techniques they were using. He knew when they were getting close to areas that might expose him, and he adjusted his operations accordingly. He continued making dead drops. He continued receiving payments. He continued providing classified information to Russian intelligence. And the compromises continued, unexplained, attributed to operational errors or bad luck, never connected to the quiet FBI agent who had been investigated twice and cleared twice and was still sitting at his desk, reading reports about the search for a mole who had never been found. Chapter 3. How They Found the Second Traitor by Paying His Handler, November 2000. FBI Headquarters, Washington, D.C. The mole hunt had been running for 6 years since Aldrich Ames's arrest. Investigators had reviewed thousands of files, interviewed hundreds of personnel, and analyzed every compromise that occurred after February 1994. They had identified patterns, but no suspects with sufficient evidence to justify arrest. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former KGB officer approached the CIA with an offer. He had access to a file on an active Russian intelligence source inside American intelligence. He would sell the file for $7 million. The CIA negotiated. The amount was reduced to $4.6 million. The payment was authorized. In November 2000, the file was delivered. It contained documents related to a KGB operation that had been running since 1985. The operation involved an FBI agent who had volunteered to provide classified information in exchange for money. The file did not contain the agent's true name. The KGB had used a code name, but the file contained other information: dates of dead drops, locations where packages had been exchanged, copies of documents the source had provided, and most critically, a plastic bag that had been used to wrap money during a payment. The bag contained fingerprints. FBI forensic technicians compared the fingerprints to FBI personnel records. The prints matched Robert Hanssen, a supervisory special agent in the FBI's Information Resources Division. Investigators reviewed Hanssen's access history. His positions over the previous 15 years gave him access to exactly the operations that had been compromised. He had been investigated twice, in 1987 and again in 1994. Both times he had been cleared. He had continued working in sensitive positions with access to classified operations. He had read reports about the mole hunt that was searching for him. The FBI placed Hanssen under intensive surveillance in December 2000. They monitored his movements, recorded his communications, and waited for him to make a dead drop that would provide evidence for prosecution. On February 18, 2001, Hanssen left his house in the evening and drove to Foxstone Park in Northern Virginia. FBI surveillance teams followed at a distance. Hanssen walked into the park carrying a package. He approached a footbridge and placed the package underneath. He marked the drop with a signal, a piece of white tape on a nearby sign. FBI agents moved in. Hanssen was walking back toward his car when they surrounded him. Agents identified themselves. Hanssen stopped walking. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not attempt to run. He looked at the agents and said, "What took you so long?" The question hung in the cold air. One of the agents later said it felt like Hanssen had been expecting this moment for years. Not fearing it, expecting it, as if he had been waiting to see how long it would take them to find what had been in front of them the entire time. Hanssen was taken into custody. The package he had placed under the bridge contained classified FBI documents describing current operations against Russian intelligence. He had been preparing to make a delivery when he was caught in the act. During interrogation over the following weeks, Hanssen provided limited cooperation. He confirmed that he had been working for Soviet and later Russian intelligence since 1985. He confirmed that he had provided classified information over 15 years. He refused to provide complete details about all the information he had passed or all the operations he had compromised. To avoid the death penalty, Hanssen agreed to a plea agreement. He would cooperate with investigators and provide information about his activities in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. His wife would be allowed to keep a portion of his FBI pension. Robert Hanssen was sentenced in May 2002. Aldrich Ames was already serving his life sentence at the same federal facility. The two men who had both reported to Viktor Cherkashin, who had both betrayed American intelligence for money, who had operated simultaneously for 9 years without knowing each other existed, were now imprisoned in the same building. They were kept in separate units. They never met. The damage assessment revealed one operation that stood out among all others. The FBI had spent years and millions of dollars building a tunnel under the Soviet embassy in Washington to intercept communications. Hanssen had informed the KGB about the tunnel in 1985, shortly after he began his espionage. The Soviets knew about the tunnel but did not shut it down immediately. They used it to feed false information to American intelligence while protecting their genuine communications through other channels. The FBI continued operating the tunnel, believing it was secure, unaware that every intercept was known to the KGB. The tunnel remained operational until 1990. The FBI did not learn it had been compromised until Hanssen's confession in 2001. 16 years after the compromise occurred. Combined with Aldrich Ames's betrayals, the two men had compromised virtually every significant American intelligence operation against the Soviet Union and Russia during the final years of the Cold War and the decade following its end. Dmitry Polyakov was executed in 1988. He had worked for American intelligence for over 20 years. He had provided information that helped shape Western understanding of Soviet military capabilities during some of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. When he was arrested, his wife was told he had committed crimes against the state. She was not told he had been betrayed by an American intelligence officer who sold his name for $50,000. Polyakov's son, Alexander, was 32 years old when his father was executed. He worked as an engineer in Moscow. After his father's arrest, Alexander was questioned by the KGB, but not charged. He lost his job. He was barred from working in his profession. He spent the rest of his life under suspicion, associated with a traitor, never officially told what his father had actually done or why. In 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Alexander requested information from Russian authorities about his father's case. He wanted to understand why his father had been executed. The request was denied. The case remained classified. In 2003, after both Ames and Hanssen had been convicted and their cases had been publicized, Alexander contacted the American embassy in Moscow. He asked if his father had worked for American intelligence. He asked if the Americans had any information about what happened. The embassy could neither confirm nor deny any intelligence relationship. That was the official response. Alexander never received an answer. Sergei Motorin and Valery Martinov, both KGB officers who had been recruited by the CIA, were executed in 1987. Both had families in Moscow. Both families were told their relatives had committed treason against the Soviet state. Neither family was contacted by American intelligence after the executions. The CIA did not publicly acknowledge relationships with agents who had been compromised. Operational security required that some compromises remain classified. The identities of some agents could not be revealed even after their deaths, because doing so would compromise other sources or methods still in use. Families who suspected their relatives had worked for American intelligence and had been betrayed received no confirmation. Inquiries were met with responses that neither confirmed nor denied any intelligence relationships. The institutional failures that allowed both men to operate for so long were reviewed extensively. One finding stood out. If the CIA and FBI had fully coordinated their investigations in 1987, when both agencies first identified patterns of compromise, they might have identified both penetrations years earlier. That coordination failure allowed Ames to operate until 1994 and Hanssen until 2001. 9 years for Ames, 15 years for Hanssen. The question of whether the time could have been shorter remained unanswered in the official reports. Some compromises that occurred during the period when Ames and Hanssen were active could not be definitively attributed to either man. These unexplained losses raised questions about whether there had been additional sources who were never identified. Those questions remain unanswered. No additional arrests have been publicly announced. Whether other penetrations existed, whether they were found, or whether they remain undiscovered, is information that intelligence agencies have not disclosed. The files related to the Ames and Hanssen cases remain largely classified. The full damage assessment, the complete list of compromised operations, and the identities of all betrayed agents are not public information. The $4.6 million that purchased Robert Hanssen's file was paid to a former KGB officer who had participated in operations against American intelligence. The payment was authorized because after 6 years of investigation, the FBI and CIA could not identify their own traitor without purchasing the information from the intelligence service he had been working for. The file that identified Hanssen had been in Russian possession since 1985. For 15 years, while American intelligence searched for penetrations, the answer existed in KGB archives. When Russian intelligence decided to sell that answer, American intelligence paid.